October 1916, a valley in France. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Mud covered everything. It filled the trenches knee, deep in some places. Canadian Sergeant Harold Mitchell stood in the forward observation post, watching through his binoculars as another operation failed. Funds 200 yards away. A German machine gunner sat inside a concrete pillbox. The gray building looked small from this distance, but Mitchell knew it was killing his men. Yesterday, 7 soldiers died trying to move supplies across open ground. The day before that, 9 more. The German gunner could see everything from his position on the ridge. Mitchell lowered his binoculars and shook his head. This was the 3rd sniper team he'd sent forward this week. Each time the same result. The snipers would set up their rifles. They would look through their scopes. They would aim at the distant pillbox and they would miss. The target was simply too far away. British Army scopes could make a target look 3 times bigger than it actually was. At 600 yards, that worked fine. At 800 yards, things got blurry. At one's 200 yards, the German machine gunner looked like a gray smudge against a gray background. You couldn't hit what you couldn't see clearly. The numbers told a terrible story. Across the British and Canadian lines, enemy snipers and machine gunners positioned far away were killing 47 men every single day. 47 lives lost because the Allied forces couldn't shoot back accurately at distances beyond 800 yards. The artillery could reach those targets. Of course, big guns could throw shells miles away. But calling in artillery for every single distant machine gun nest was slow. It wasted shells. By the time the big guns started firing, the German soldiers often moved to new positions. And the constant bombing ate through ammunition supplies that were already running low. Mitchell had watched officers argue about this problem for months. Everyone agreed something needed to change. Nobody could figure out what. The British War Office had spent 250,000 developing their rifle scopes. Teams of engineers and lens makers worked on the design. Surely, the officers said, this was the best equipment money could buy. If trained marksmen couldn't hit targets at long range, well, maybe those targets were simply out of reach. Maybe warfare had limits. Maybe some machine gun nests just had to be dealt with using artillery or frontal attacks. No matter how many men died in the process. In the reserve trenches half a mile behind the front lines, Corporal Francis Pegamagabo cleaned his rifle. He was Ojibwe from the Parry Island Band north of Georgian Bay. Before the war, he worked as a hunting guide. He took wealthy men from Toronto into the woods and helped them shoot deer and elk. He knew guns. He knew optics. He'd spent years watching animals at long distances, calculating wind and drop, and the 1,000 tiny things that separate a hit from a miss. Pegamagabo had been watching the sniper teams fail. He'd been taking notes in a small leather journal he carried in his pack. He wrote down distances. He wrote down weather conditions. He wrote down every detail of how the standard army scopes performed, and he'd started to see the real problem. Everyone else thought the scopes failed because they didn't magnify enough. That was part of it, sure. But Pegamagabo noticed something the trained officers missed. He watched how the scopes wobbled on their mounts when snipers adjusted position. He saw how the metal rings holding the scope to the rifle had tiny gaps, little spaces where movement could slip in. At 600 yards, that wobble didn't matter much. At one's 200 yards, that tiny movement meant missing by 10 feet or more. He also noticed the eye relief problem. Eye relief was the distance your eye needed to be from the scope lens to see a clear picture. The Army scopes required your eye to be exactly 2 inches away. Get closer or farther, and the image got dark around the edges. When soldiers were tired, when they were cold, when they'd been crouching in muddy trenches for hours, they couldn't hold that perfect 2-inch distance. Their shots went wild. Pegamagabo started thinking about solutions. Back home, he'd modified hunting rifles dozens of times. He'd fitted scopes onto guns that weren't designed for them. He'd made custom mounts using whatever materials he could find. The principles were the same here. The scale was just bigger, the stakes higher. He mentioned his ideas to Lieutenant Andrew McNaughton during a supply run. McNaughton was an artillery observer who spent his days trying to spot distant targets for the big guns. He was just as frustrated as everyone else with the equipment. When Pegamagabo explained his theory about scope mounting and eye relief, McNaughton listened. He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss it. He asked questions. Then, Pegamagabo made his formal proposal to the British officers at headquarters. He walked into the command tent with his notes and his diagrams. He explained how he could modify the existing scopes. He showed them calculations proving his mounting system would work. The officers looked at him like he'd suggested they fight the Germans with sharp sticks. Backyard tinkering, they called it. Amateur foolishness. The War Office had spent a fortune on these scopes. Engineers with university degrees designed them. What could a colonial corporal, an indigenous hunting guide, possibly know that they didn't? They laughed him out of the tent. But Pegamagabo had seen something they couldn't see. He'd noticed that the real problem wasn't the quality of British engineering. It was that the engineers had never actually fired these scopes at 200 yards in muddy trenches while being shot at. They'd tested them on calm days at firing ranges. Reality was different, and reality needed different solutions. Pegamagabo didn't wait for permission. 3 days after the officers laughed at him, he started working in a quiet corner of the reserve trenches. He'd found what he needed during a patrol through a destroyed observation post. British artillery observers used telescopes to watch enemy positions and call in fire. One of these telescopes lay smashed in the rubble, but its main lens was still intact. Pegamagabo picked it up and turned it over in his hands. The glass was thick and heavy, designed to gather light and show clear images at long distances. This lens magnified things 8 times bigger than normal. That was more than twice as powerful as the standard Army scopes. He took the lens back to his shelter and started planning. The telescope lens was too big to fit directly onto a rifle scope body. He needed to modify an existing scope to hold it. He chose an Aldis scope, the kind artillery observers used. The Aldis had a solid metal body, stronger than the regular sniper scopes. Over the next week, working by candlelight after his shifts on the line, Pegamagabo carefully fitted the telescope lens into the Aldis body. He had to file down the edges of the lens mount to make everything fit together. The work was slow. One mistake would ruin the lens forever. But the lens was only part of the solution. The real innovation came in how he mounted the scope to the rifle. This was where everyone else had failed without knowing it. Pegamagabo collected spent brass shell casings from the firing range. He sat with a metal file and worked the brass for hours, creating thin flat pieces called shims. These shims would go between the scope rings and the rifle, filling in the tiny gaps where wobble happened. The measurements had to be perfect. Pagamagabo did the math in his journal. At one's 200 yards, if the scope moved just half a degree, the bullet would miss by 10 feet. He needed to hold the scope so steady that it moved less than 1/10 of a degree. That meant his brass shims had to be exactly the right thickness. He measured them with calipers borrowed from the artillery repair shop. Each shim was filed down to 2/100ths of a millimeter. That's thinner than a human hair. Too thick and the scope mount would crack under pressure. Too thin and the wobble would remain. He made 6 different shims before he got the thickness right. The brass was soft enough to file, but hard enough to hold firm under the shock of firing. When he finally fitted them into place, the scope sat rock solid on the rifle. No movement, no wobble. He pushed on it with his thumb. Nothing shifted. The eye relief problem needed a different solution. Pagamagabo cut a piece of leather from an old boot and shaped it into a cheek rest. This rest attached to the rifle stock and positioned his face exactly 3.5 inches from the scope lens. Every time he aimed, his eye would be in the perfect spot automatically. He didn't have to think about it or measure it. The leather rest did the work for him. When he finished, he had a scope that magnified 7.5 times, gathered more than twice as much light as standard equipment, and sat perfectly stable on the rifle. The whole thing cost him about 3 pounds in materials. A factory-made scope cost 45 pounds and didn't work nearly as well at long range. Now he needed to test it. But firing a rifle in the reserve trenches would bring officers, running with questions he didn't want to answer yet. He needed a place where shooting was normal and expected. He needed someone willing to look the other way while he worked. Lieutenant McNaughton appeared at Pagamagabo's shelter one cold morning in late October. The artillery observer had been thinking about their earlier conversation. His own frustration with spotting distant targets had grown worse. When Pagamagabo showed him the modified scope, McNaughton held it up to the light and peered through the lens. His eyebrows went up. The clarity was remarkable. He could read letters on a supply crate 200 yards away that looked like gray blurs through his regular binoculars. McNaughton made a decision that could have ended his career. He offered Pagamagabo access to the artillery observation range. This range stretched 500 yards across empty farmland behind the Canadian lines. Artillery observers used it to practice spotting targets at extreme distances. McNaughton told the range guards that Pagamagabo was testing equipment for a special project. The guards didn't ask questions. Officers did strange things all the time during the war. For 3 mornings, Pagamagabo arrived at the range before dawn. He set up targets at different distances: 800 yards, 1,000 yards, 200 yards, 500 yards. He fired slowly and carefully, adjusting his aim after each shot. He kept detailed notes about wind speed, temperature, and how the bullets dropped over distance. The results were stunning. At 200 yards, using the standard Army scope, trained snipers hit their targets about 12 times out of every 100 shots. Pagamagabo, using his modified scope, hit 68 times out of 100. The difference wasn't small. It was the difference between useless and deadly. McNaughton watched the 3rd morning session and saw enough. He went straight to Major General Arthur Currie, the commander of the Canadian Corps. Currie was known for listening to unusual ideas if they worked. McNaughton brought the target sheets showing Pagamagabo's hit rates. He brought the scope itself. He explained everything. Curry studied the numbers for a long time. Then he asked one question. Could Pegamagabo hit that German machine gunner in the pillbox, the one that had been killing Canadian soldiers for 2 weeks, the one sitting 400 yards away that nobody else could touch? Pegamagabo said he could. Curry authorized a field test for November 3, 1916. Word spread quickly through the trenches. The Americans in the adjacent sector heard about it. They heard that some Canadian corporal with a homemade scope was going to try an impossible shot. American officers sent observers to watch. They expected failure. They expected to see another useless colonial experiment blow up in everyone's face. Some of them joked about it over breakfast. One American lieutenant called it backyard garbage made from junk and spit. They said it belonged in a trash heap, not on a battlefield. November 3rd arrived cold and clear. Pegamagabo took his position in the forward trench. Behind him, 3 American observers stood watching. One of them was still smiling, shaking his head at what he thought would be an embarrassing failure. The German pillbox sat on the ridge, gray concrete against gray sky. Survey teams had measured the exact distance using their equipment. 400 yards, almost 8/10 of a mile. Pegamagabo settled the rifle against his shoulder. The leather cheek rest positioned his eye perfectly. Through his homemade scope, he could see the dark opening of the pillbox clearly. He could see the shadow of movement inside. He waited for the wind to drop. He let out half a breath. He squeezed the trigger. The German machine gunner fell. 1 shot, direct hit. 400 yards. The American observers stopped smiling. Their mouths hung open. One of them stepped forward immediately, his hand reaching for the scope. The backyard garbage had just done what their expensive military equipment could not. The numbers told the story better than words ever could. Before Pegamagabo's scope appeared on the Canadian lines, sniper teams averaged 1.3 confirmed kills per week at ranges beyond 800 yards. That was across all the Canadian snipers working the Somme sector. 1 kill per week for every sniper team. Meanwhile, those same sniper teams were losing men at an alarming rate. 23% of snipers sent to engage long-range targets became casualties themselves. The German counter-snipers were winning. After November 3rd, everything changed. Within 2 weeks, Canadian sniper teams equipped with modified scopes were averaging 8.7 kills per week at long range. Their casualty rate dropped to 9%. The difference wasn't small or gradual. It was immediate and overwhelming. Suddenly, Canadian snipers owned the battlefield at distances beyond 1,000 yards. German soldiers, who thought they were safe in their distant positions, started dying. Major General Curry understood what he was seeing. This wasn't just one good shot by one talented soldier. This was a complete shift in how warfare worked at long range. He authorized immediate production of more scopes, but this created a problem. The Canadian Corps didn't have factories making precision optics. They had muddy fields and cold trenches, and workshops meant for fixing broken wagons. Curry assigned engineers to figure out how to produce Pegamagabo's design under field conditions. The engineers studied his scope for 3 days. They measured every part. They took notes on the brass shims and the leather cheek rest, and how the telescope lens fitted into the Aldous body. Then they visited every destroyed observation post and damaged artillery position in the Canadian sector, collecting salvaged telescope lenses. They found 38 usable lenses. In the first week, the workshop team set up production lines in reserve area barns. soldiers with metalwork experience were pulled from regular duties and taught how to file brass shims to the correct thickness. Each shim took about 40 minutes to make. The work required steady hands and good eyes. The calipers had to show exactly 0.02 of a millimeter, or the shim got thrown away and the soldier started over. By January 1917, the Canadian workshops had produced 247 modified scopes. Each one cost approximately $43 in materials and labor. The British factory scopes cost the $45 each and couldn't match the performance. Some quick math showed the Canadians had created equipment worth $11,000 in factory terms while spending only about $2,740 in actual costs. And their equipment worked better. The scopes went to the best marksmen in each battalion. Training took 2 days. Soldiers learned how to account for bullet drop at extreme distances. They learned how to read wind at 1,000 yards by watching grass movement and dust patterns. They learned that at these ranges, even the rotation of the earth had to be considered. A bullet flying for 3 full seconds would drift slightly to the right in the northern hemisphere, because the planet was spinning underneath it. The drift was small, only about 6 inches at once 200 yards, but it was enough to turn a kill shot into a miss. The British High Command heard about the Canadian success, but resisted adopting the design. British officers didn't like the idea that colonial soldiers using salvaged parts had invented something better than official War Office equipment. It felt wrong. It challenged the natural order of things. Besides, the British argued, maybe the Canadian success was just luck. Maybe Pega Mangabo was simply an exceptionally talented shooter, and the scope had nothing to do with it. Then came Vimy Ridge in April 1917. The Canadians were preparing for a massive assault on this German-held position. Before the infantry attack, Canadian snipers went to work. Over 2 weeks, they eliminated 89 German artillery spotters positioned in observation posts between 1,000 and 1,400 yards away. These spotters were the eyes of the German artillery. Without them, German gunners were firing blind. When the Canadian infantry finally attacked Vimy Ridge on April 9th, the German artillery response was confused and poorly aimed. The Canadian casualties were far lower than expected. British generals studied the Vimy Ridge operation reports. They read about the sniper success. They saw the numbers. Finally, in May 1917, the War Office authorized limited production of scopes based on the Canadian design. The British version cost more because they insisted on using new components instead of salvaged ones. But the basic design was the same. Pega Mangabo's brass shim system, his eye relief solution, his mounting technique. The Germans noticed they were losing the long-range fight. Their intelligence officers collected reports from survivors about Canadian snipers hitting targets at distances the Germans thought were impossible. In March 1917, the German army responded by creating special Scharfschützen, precision marksman squads equipped with improved 4x magnification Zeiss scopes. These were excellent scopes, probably the best factory-made optics in the world at that time. But they still only worked effectively out to 900 yards. The Canadians could shoot accurately 300 to 600 yards beyond that range. The Germans had improved their equipment, but they still couldn't match the modified Canadian scopes. German soldiers started changing their behavior. They stopped moving during daylight at any distance they thought might be within Canadian sniper range. They built their observation posts farther back from the front lines. They dug their trenches deeper. The psychological effect was almost as important as the actual casualties. German soldiers knew that nowhere was truly safe. A Canadian sniper might be watching from over a mile away, and the first sign of his presence would be one of your friends falling dead. Pegamagabo himself became a legend among both Canadian and German troops. He kept a small notebook where he recorded every confirmed kill. The official number reached 378 by the time the war ended in November 1918, but his fellow soldiers believed the real number was much higher, probably over 500. Many kills happened during chaotic battles where nobody had time to confirm exactly who shot whom. 1 week at Passchendaele stood out in the records. The Battle of Passchendaele was fought in October and November 1917 in conditions even worse than the Somme. Rain turned the battlefield into a swamp. Men drowned in shell holes filled with water. In one 7-day period during this nightmare, Pegamagabo eliminated 31 German soldiers. 7 of them were officers identified by their uniforms and binoculars. The ranges for these shots varied between 1 Zalozan and 450 yards. Every shot was fired in terrible weather, through rain or fog or both. The Americans finally admitted they'd been wrong. By summer 1918, American forces were arriving in France in large numbers. They brought Springfield rifles with standard scopes. These scopes worked fine at normal ranges, but failed at distances beyond 800 yards, just like everyone else's equipment. Lieutenant Colonel Townsend Whelan, an American ordnance officer, spent a week with Canadian sniper units. He test-fired their modified scopes. He reviewed their kill records. Then he wrote a report to the War Department in Washington. The report was blunt and honest. The Canadian improvised optics, Whelan wrote, had proven superior to American Springfield scopes in every measurable category. He recommended immediate adoption of the Canadian design. American workshops in France started producing modified scopes in August 1918. The war ended 3 months later, so American snipers didn't get much time to use them. But the ones who did reported the same results the Canadians had seen. Better accuracy, longer range, more kills, lower casualties. By the time the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, the modified scopes had changed how armies thought about long-range shooting. What started as one corporal's homemade experiment had become standard equipment across multiple armies. The impossible had become routine. When the war ended in November 1918, Francis Pegamagabo packed his rifle and his modified scope and went home to Canada. He thought his service would mean something. He thought saving hundreds of lives through his innovation would earn him respect. He was wrong about both things. Pegamagabo returned to a country that still saw indigenous people as second-class citizens. The same officers who'd praised him in France wouldn't shake his hand in Toronto. He applied for jobs using his military record and got turned away. Factory managers looked at his Ojibwe name and told him all positions were filled. The British Army gave him the Military Medal with 2 bars. This was the 3rd highest decoration Britain awarded for bravery. Only the Victoria Cross and the Distinguished Conduct Medal ranked higher. Pegamagabo was the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian history. None of that mattered to the men hiring at the steel mill or the lumber yard. He ended up working at a factory that made rope. The pay was low. The work was hard. Nobody there knew or cared what he'd done during the war. But his scope design lived on even as the man who invented it faded into obscurity. Military engineers in Britain and America studied the principles behind his modifications. They understood now what Pegamagabo had figured out in a muddy trench with a file and some brass casings. The stability of the scope mount mattered more than the quality of the glass. Eye relief consistency determined whether a soldier could actually use the magnification effectively. These weren't complicated ideas, but nobody had put them together correctly until Pega-Magabo did. In the 1930s, the British Army adopted the pattern 1918 telescopic sight as standard equipment for sniper rifles. The design borrowed heavily from Pega-Magabo's work. The mounting system used precisely machined shims to eliminate wobble, exactly like his brass shim concept. The eye relief was calculated to allow consistent positioning without requiring the shooter to think about it. The pattern 1918 became the foundation for British sniper scopes through World War II and beyond. Thousands of these scopes were manufactured. British and Commonwealth snipers used them in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Every single one traced its basic design back to a hunting guide from Perry Island, who nobody had wanted to listen to. American scope makers followed a similar path. John Inertle, who became famous in the 1950s for building target-grade rifle scopes, developed a mounting system that used the same principles Pega-Magabo discovered. Inertle's scopes were considered the best in the world for long-range precision shooting. Competitive shooters paid premium prices for them. The marketing materials talked about innovative engineering and scientific design. Nobody mentioned that the core concept came from a Canadian corporal filing brass in a trench 40 years earlier. The evolution continued through the decades. By the 1960s, variable power scopes allowed shooters to adjust magnification from 3 times to 9 times or higher with a simple twist of a ring. But these advanced scopes still needed solid mounting systems to work correctly. Engineers still struggled with the same problem Pega-Magabo solved: the problem of keeping a scope perfectly aligned with the rifle through thousands of shots and hard use. Modern solutions involved aerospace-grade aluminum and computer-controlled machining, but the principle remained identical: fill the gaps, eliminate the wobble, keep everything stable. Military snipers in Vietnam used scopes that incorporated Pega-Magabo's eye relief concepts without knowing where those concepts originated. Police sharpshooters training in the 1970s learned mounting techniques that could be traced directly back to his brass shim system. Hunters buying premium rifles in sporting goods stores benefited from design improvements that started with a man they'd never heard of. Pega-Magabo himself never profited from any of this. He never received royalties or recognition from the scope manufacturers who used his ideas. He worked his factory job and lived in a small house and raised his family. He became active in Indigenous rights advocacy, fighting for better treatment of First Nations people in Canada. The government usually ignored him. When he died in 1952 at age 61, his obituary in the local paper was 3 paragraphs long. It mentioned he'd served in World War I. It didn't mention the scope. It didn't mention the 378 confirmed kills. It didn't mention that he'd changed how modern warfare worked. 64 years passed before Canada inducted him into the Military Hall of Fame in 2016. By then, everyone who'd served with him was dead. The ceremony was nice, but it was also sad in its lateness. Why did it take more than 6 decades to honor the most decorated Indigenous soldier in Canadian history? The answer was uncomfortable, but obvious. Pega-Magabo was Indigenous in a country that didn't want to acknowledge Indigenous excellence. Today, precision rifle shooters compete in matches where they engage targets at distances exceeding a mile. Their equipment is extraordinary. Scopes cost 8,000 or more. The rifles are custom, built by master gunsmiths. Computer programs calculate bullet trajectories, accounting for temperature, air pressure, humidity, the Coriolis effect from Earth's rotation, even the curvature of the Earth itself for the longest shots. These shooters can hit targets the size of a dinner plate at ranges Pega would have considered impossible. But when those shooters mount their expensive scopes to their expensive rifles, they're still solving the same fundamental problem. The scope must sit perfectly stable. It cannot wobble. It cannot shift. The mounting system must be absolutely solid, or all that expensive glass and all those computer calculations mean nothing. Modern scope rings use crossed bolts and precisely machined surfaces and thread locking compounds. They're engineering marvels, but they do exactly what Pega filed brass shims did. They fill the gaps and eliminate movement. The lesson here cuts deeper than just optics and rifles. It reveals something important about how innovation actually happens. The experts at the British War Office spent for 250,000 developing scopes that didn't work well enough. They had university degrees and engineering training and access to the best workshops in Britain. They failed because they never actually had to use their equipment under real conditions. They tested on calm days at comfortable firing ranges. They never lay in freezing mud getting shot at while trying to hit a target 3.4 of a mile away. Pega succeeded because he understood the real problem. He wasn't trying to build the most expensive scope or the most impressive scope. He was trying to build a scope that worked when everything else was going wrong. He stripped the problem down to its basics. What makes a scope miss at long range? Movement and inconsistent eye position. How do you fix those things? You eliminate the movement with shims. You fix the eye position with a cheek rest. Simple solutions to clearly defined problems. Modern militaries still struggle with this lesson. Defense contractors still build weapon systems that work beautifully in laboratories and fail in deserts or jungles or mountains. Billions of dollars still get spent on equipment that sounds impressive in presentations but breaks under real use. The pattern repeats endlessly because institutions resist learning from unexpected sources. Pega scope reminds us that the best answer might come from someone everyone is ignoring. The solution might be simple and cheap and obvious once you see it, but you have to be willing to look past credentials and titles and prejudices. You have to be willing to consider that maybe, just maybe, the hunting guide from the colonies knows something the generals don't.